Welcome, and thank you for listening to Sandy Creek Stirrings. I'm your host, Joshua Jimenez.
And if you're going to win souls, you've got to love souls. In spite of their meanness, in spite of the way they look, in spite of everything, you've got to seek to bring souls to Jesus Christ because you love them, because Jesus loved them, and because Jesus died for them, and you're trying to bring them to the Son of God.
The Bible says in Psalm 84:11, my last verse, "For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly." I've based my whole life on that it pays to serve God, and I believe that with all my heart.
God has given us a guidebook. God has given us a directional map. And that guidebook, that map, is the precious Word of God.
Listen, don't just go and sit in the pew. Find some way to serve, and serve as a family. Be a part of everything at church. And when you learn to love what God loves, your children will learn to love it as well.
Homes are not that spiritually strong. We're getting overtaken by the world quickly, but unfortunately, we're pumping all the sewage in. We're letting the world in when that ought to be a haven.
When I first came on staff as what you might call a bivocational assistant to the pastor 7 years ago now, I'll be honest with you, I was not prepared for the hurt and the pain that can sometimes come along with ministry. Now, I had heard about the hurt. I had heard about, pastors who leave the ministry because they get burnt out, they get hurt, and they just quit. And I can say I've heard about it, but I cannot say that I was prepared for it. And when I first began to be on staff here and handle ministries and be, the next man up to the pastor, you might say, I was not prepared for some of the hurt and pain you would suffer. Now, I don't want to, at the same time, while I'm here today and we're going to discuss a subject that I'll give you here in just a minute, I don't want it to make it sound like, for those of you listening, maybe the younger crowd, the teenagers, the single, college students, I don't want it to make it sound like ministry is a horrible life. It's not. Ministry is by far the best life you can live, period. I'm sorry, no exceptions. It just really is. It's an incredible life, especially when you've been called by God to go into the ministry. And that's just, oh man, it's amazing. But at the same time, just like any calling, whether God calls you to be a dump truck driver, he calls you to be a pastor, he calls you to be a banker or a lawyer, there's always going to be ups and downs. Let me put it to you like this, and I used to tell my coworkers and my employees when I was in retail management, I used to tell the people under me, I'd say, this business would be great if it weren't for the people, right? It makes people laugh because you wouldn't have a business if it wasn't for the people, right? I mean, that's what makes the business, that's what makes money, is your customer base and your people. But everybody who has worked in retail completely understands what I'm saying when I say this would be great if it weren't for the people. Because sometimes you have people who come in and they are angry, they are mean, they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, and they're going to take it out on you, the hardware salesman, because you gave them the wrong piece, or maybe they didn't like what you told them, or maybe you told them that, you can't fit that piece of pipe in that coupler, that just doesn't work together. And for whatever reason, your solution to their hardware problem, which was what I was in hardware, whatever reason, the solution you gave them is just the over-the-top news, and they just blow it. I've been cussed out. I've been threatened. I have been, all because I told them that what they were trying to do would not work. And, that's where that phrase almost comes from. This would be great if it weren't for the people. Now, on the flip side, I had some great customers during my time in hardware that I enjoyed talking to. They would come in. It was like seeing a friend, and you do develop that relationship with your customer base, but it can be good and bad. Just like any area in life, it has its ups and downs. When I was the manager of this hardware store that I worked at, one of the things that I really enjoyed was the hiring process. I enjoyed looking over resumes and trying to find what I felt to be the best employee. To me, and maybe I just had way too much fun with it, but I felt like I was the general manager for a football team and I was adding a player to my roster. and you want to pick the best player, right? Out of all these guys in the draft, you want to pick the best player who best fits your needs. And so, maybe it's wrong to look at it that way, but that's the way I looked at it. This is so much fun hiring people. On the flip side, the worst part was firing people. Now, I can tell you the story, and I'm not going to today, but I can tell you the story of two people that I really enjoyed firing, but that was few and far between. At my particular hardware store, we had a lot of turnover. We had, in my 5 years that I was there, we had over 70 employees come through and back out the doors. And you say, that's terrible. Brother Josh, you are not a very good manager. Well, I didn't take manager. Let's not go into that. Let's just say that how can I put this? They just weren't paid very well, and the pay scale was not part of my job. And so naturally, you're going to have turnover, and where you have employees you hire, and they're gone 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, a year later. And so, but the worst part about it was firing people. I had people who I really enjoyed, and maybe they weren't the right fit for hardware. Maybe they weren't the right fit for the business. Maybe I didn't even necessarily like them, but you still don't like firing people. It's hard. It's tough. Saying goodbye is hard. I mean, that's why when we get to a funeral, people are crying. Saying goodbye is hard. When you say goodbye to a loved one and you know you're not going to see them for a few years, that's hard. For the missionary kids out there and the missionary families, saying goodbye and leaving for the field, that's hard. Saying goodbye is difficult. But it's part of being a human. Part of being a human is sometimes where you're going and where somebody else is going leads in two different paths. And there's no other way to get around it. And in life, and in retail, and in whatever business you're in, and in ministry, there is, and I don't know what else to term it other than what I termed it when I referred to the hardware store. There is turnover when you come into the ministry. There are people who get saved. They are on fire. Oh, this is great. They rededicate their life to the Lord. Maybe they were saved before. They find your church, and this is exciting. There's never been another place like this. I love my church, love my pastor, love my church family, and all this is just awesome. And they're in, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and then 3 months later, they're gone. And it hurts. Yeah, it hurts. There are people who you develop a relationship with. They become literally part. There's a reason we call it church family. They become a part of your family. And can I just put it this way? For many, 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 many people, their church family is closer to them than their biological family. And when somebody leaves the family, it hurts. You have invested time with that person. You have reached out to them. You've been friends. You've had a relationship. And there are some people who they leave on a good note, and it's a bittersweet goodbye. Maybe they're moving. We're moving down here, but we're gonna be in this church and be helping them. That's a bittersweet. Yeah, you're sad to see them go, but they're doing great. They're leaving for the right reasons. They're moving, whatever it may be. But on the other side, the ones that really hurt are the ones who leave on a bad note. And if you were to talk to your pastor or your assistant to the pastor or somebody in ministry, they're not going to give you the details of the story. Well, so-and-so did this, and let me tell you, they're not going to give you the details. But if you were to ask them, say, preacher, has it ever hurt you when somebody has left? I guarantee you, if they've been in the ministry any length of time, they will tell you yes. There have been times when I've been hurt, where I have maybe considered, am I really in the right field of service? Where I maybe thought about quitting for a minute or two. Because people can hurt you. People can hurt you. The person who said sticks and stones may break my bones, they must have been a hermit on some island who never met anybody, because words do hurt. And actions can hurt. And sometimes in a ministry, You will have people who you've invested time with and all those things I mentioned before who will leave on a bad note, and they'll quit. And sometimes you don't even know why. I think that may be sometimes the most hurtful ones are people who they just left and you don't even know why. They just quit. They quit on the church family. They quit really on God. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about the people who maybe for whatever reason leave your church and they go to another church of like faith that's, 20, 30 minutes away. I'm not talking about those situations. I'm talking about the people who quit and they just don't go to church anymore. They quit on God. That's what I'm talking about. And it does hurt. And when I became the assistant to the pastor bivocationally at first and then eventually came on staff full time, that's something that I was not prepared for. And there have been times when, as I said, I don't mean to be rude or harsh or whatever, but there are times when turnover happens and people leave. And it hurts. And I was at a restaurant the other week with one of our church members, and me and him were talking, and he mentioned to me, the subject came up about people leaving churches and just how tough it is, how much it hurts. And we didn't gossip about anybody or backbite, or we just talking about the general subject of it hurts when people leave. And he had told me, he said, you know what, it would be a good idea. He asked this question, and he said, this should maybe be something you consider for the podcast. He said, are there signs that people give when they're going to leave a church? And I said, absolutely. I can tell you family after family who they've ended up leaving, and I knew they were going to leave a couple months ahead of time. You say, that's terrible, Brother Josh. That is terrible. Why didn't you do something? I did do something. But the sad truth is a lot of people make up their mind that they're going to leave a little while before they actually do, especially those who are leaving for the wrong reasons. That's just the way it is. I apologize if that sounds bad, but that's just the way it is. I had employees at the hardware store, this is not ministry, who I knew they were going to quit. They didn't give me their 2-week notice. They didn't tell me in a conversation that they were looking for other jobs, but I just knew they're getting ready to leave. And what do you know? 2 months later, well, hey, I just want to let you know that I've been looking for other jobs, and I went through some interviews, and, I'm going to have to give you my 2-day notice. And I was like, well, you signed you said you'd give me a 2-week notice. And, but that's the way it is. People make these decisions. And there are some signs people give when they are going to leave a church. And I'm going to give you some of those today. Signs that you're about to leave your church. Signs that you're about to leave your church. And here's what I don't want this episode to be. I don't want this episode to be those busybodies in the church listening. And I'm not even referencing my church necessarily. I'm just saying in general across America, this is not the episode for the busybodies to latch onto and go look at your congregation and say, well, that person checks this box, this box, this box, this box, this one. Preacher, I think so-and-so's about to leave. That's not what this episode is for. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this episode and look at yourself and say, are there any of these boxes that I check off that I'm not leaving? I'm here to stay. But you know what? I'm probably giving the wrong message because I'm not doing right in that area. That's how I want this episode to be used. I was talking with my pastor, my boss, just before I went to go to record this episode. I said, hey, here's what I'm thinking about for a podcast episode. I said, do you want me to touch the subject? Do you want me to leave it alone? And if my pastor wants to override me, now this podcast isn't necessarily a church ministry. It's something that I do in my free time. And but I don't ever want to do something that would jeopardize or hurt our ministry or say something, and that comes first. And if my pastor told me, hey, I want you to shut down your podcast, I'd shut it down. It'd be done. It'd be over with. But I asked him about the subject. I said, do you want me just to leave this one alone? Somebody brought it up as a question, and I thought about answering it on the podcast, but I wanted to check with you first. He said, no, go for it. Go for it. So with his permission, I'm going to give a list of a couple things that people do when they're about to leave a church. Really, most of the times I'm pointing out people who are leaving for the wrong reasons, and they're just about to quit. Let me give you a couple things that people do just before they're going to leave church. And, this can apply to a lot of different areas, whether it be in an employment, secular employment, or whether it be in different areas, this can apply in the same way. One of the first things that someone will do when they are about to leave a church is they will begin to show up to services late, and they'll leave the services early. Now, I'm not talking about they get up while the pastor's preaching and they leave, but they'll show up, services start at 6, and they pull into the parking lot at 5:59. And then as soon as preacher says, all right, you're dismissed, they are up and they are out the door, first people out the door. Now, is that the case all the time? No, listen to me. I'm not dumb. I understand there are certain exceptions. I understand there are certain people who, praise the Lord, they were there for Sunday night, but they've got to get to work, and they work a night shift right after church is done, and they've got to beat it. I understand that, and those are common sense situations that you obviously know. They have a good reason. But you do have those people. And I'm not going to go name names today, but I could if I wanted to name names of previous and past and year 2 of our church or 3, 4, 5, whatever, who that was just one of the signs they were planning on leaving. They just come in late, they leave, they come purely for the service. And by the way, you've heard me on the podcast before say that coming for the preaching or coming for the singing isn't the only thing you come to church for. You go to the book of Acts, you find the church came together to worship the Lord, to hear the word of God spoken, to pray together, but really that fourth thing was for fellowship. You find in the book of Acts where they came together, one of the reasons was for fellowship, and I believe preaching is the most important, right? For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. I believe that's number one. I believe worshiping God is right up there with preaching. I'm not going to get into how I would rate them today, but worshiping God right there. Prayer is a big one, but I believe fellowship is just as important to be part of the service. And when you come and you don't allow time for fellowship, which is really before the service and after the service, you're starting to miss out on that time with your family, your church family. Let me put it to you this way. You are a husband and wife. You have one single child. They are now 19, they're 20, and all of a sudden, they're getting older, and they leave at 7 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and you get up at 7. They leave at 7 to go to work, and then they come back at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And then when they get there, they just go to their room, and that's pretty much the only time you see them is, hey, Dad, hey, Mom, when they walk in the door, and that's about it. Would it not bother you? Would you not think that, hey, they're working real hard, but, I don't know if it's right. Something seems a little off, because it would. Because as a family, what do you need? You need fellowship. You need camaraderie. And that's something that people will sometimes do when they're preparing to leave a church. They will try and shut it off. And here's what they're trying to do. They may have already arrived at the point where they don't care about relationships. But one of the reasons somebody will come in late and leave early is they don't want to extend or develop any more relationships. They want to kind of begin to deaden the hurt and pain when the goodbyes are officially said. So that's one of the things. The second thing sometimes people will begin doing, and these are not all of not every single person is going to do all of these. They'll do some of these, and this is another big one, though, very common one, is they begin to avoid the pastor and the staff. They come to church and they sit down, and the pastor goes over down this aisle, and they kind of just go up the other aisle. And, they used to come in and talk to the pastor and, shake his hand and go up to him and make sure to tell him, hey, the preaching was good or whatever. And they just don't do that anymore. They kind of just stay to themselves. The preacher comes by. Hey, it's good to see y'all. Good to see you too, preacher. Y'all doing all right? Yes, sir. Well, so glad you're here tonight. Thank you. It's just avoiding. It's not the same. Things are just different. There's an avoidance there. And maybe I'm not adequately describing it for those of you listening who you're not in ministry. I don't know how else to describe it except right? Have you ever known when somebody's trying to avoid you? Like they're still there, but they're avoiding you, right? They're avoiding you. Husbands and wives know what I'm talking about, and that sounds terrible. But they begin to avoid the pastoral staff. Another thing they begin to do is they quit giving. They quit giving. The Bible says where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so when somebody stops giving, they begin to remove their heart from the church and the church family and the ministries that they've invested in. It's very difficult when you've sat in a church for 7, 8, 9, 10 years and you've been giving to its ministries, and you've been giving, and you gave to the building program, and you gave to missions, and you gave and you invested, and you see your investment show up in the teens going to camp, and the youth activities, and the buses that the church has bought, and the building the church has built, and the decorations that go up, and the chairs you're sitting in, and the hymnals you're singing out of, and the pianos you've got, and the sound equipment you hear from, and the pastor that's been paid, and the assistant, and the youth, and all these different things. You've invested that money, invested. It's going to be very hard to leave, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Your heart is tied up in that. I know people who, they have a very hard time leaving the church they're in because they've been there for 20 years, 25 years. That church is starting to go downhill, but they have a very hard time. Why? Because they've invested in that church through their giving for so long. That's where their heart is. And that's biblical. And when somebody begins to stop giving, that's a sign that they're probably going to be leaving because their heart is no longer in it. That's why people who don't give are in a very dangerous predicament, because it's very easy for them to church hop, is what I'll call it. Go from this church to that church to that church to that church to that church. That's why it's so very important. When you find your church home, you give, and you give to that church. Don't be tithing over here to John Hagee. Don't be tithing over here to this television preacher. Don't be tithing to BBN. Tithe to your local church. That's where it goes. All right, and it's 10%. It's not you going and buying bathroom supplies and stocking the church with bathroom supplies. It's not a tithe. Your tithe is taking 10% of your income, gross, and your not your income being gross, but your gross income, and taking 10% of your gross income and putting it in the offering plate for the church needs in the general fund. That's the tithe. And so that's something people do is they quit giving. Another thing they do is they stop fellowshipping. Now, we've kind of already covered this to a degree in, leaving early, coming late, those type of things in fellowshipping. But another thing people can do is they may be on time for the services, and they may have 5 minutes before the service. They go around, they talk to a couple people, and then they go after the service and they talk to 1 or 2 people. But as a majority, they quit fellowshipping. For instance, they only come to church services. They do not do any of the extra things that a church might plan. The church is going to have a 4th of July picnic. They don't go. And I understand, I feel like I keep having to give phrases, I understand, there may be somebody who works on that 4th of July and they can't go to the picnic. I get that. But I'm talking about the people who can make it and they just choose instead not to. They would, I'd rather not. Well, what you're saying is I'd rather not fellowship with my church family. And that can be something that is a sign that your heart's not right with your church family, right? That's what it's telling you is, I think I'll just stop fellowshipping. I think I just will stop going to these events. They have we have an older, wiser, loving saints ministry. It's for our senior saints, those I believe over the age of 50, I think it is at our church. And they get together and maybe you have somebody who they're over 50, and I'm just using a hypothetical situation, and they say, you know what, I'm off, I'm not doing anything, I'm retired, they're going to meet together and they're going to have a good time, they're going to have this activity, and I'm just not going to go. I'm fine with the activity. I'm fine with it. I really don't want to. That begins to show you there might be an issue. Another way that the stopping of the fellowship can happen is instead of fellowshipping with the entire church family, they fellowship with 1, maybe 2 people. That's a very dangerous predicament to get in. And this is one of those things where, remember, I want you to question yourself and say, is any of this coming up in my life? Something that can be so common in churches is for you to fellowship with maybe 1 or 2 families, and the rest of everybody, oh, hello, goodbye. That's about it. That's the cut. Now, I know in life, people maybe your same age, people with your same situation. Maybe you have 3 kids. There's another family your age that has 3 kids. Sometimes you're going to be a little bit closer to them as people within the ministry. Not necessarily in the ministry, as people under a ministry, right? The church members, the lay people. You're naturally going to probably be closer to somebody. You're going to talk to them a little bit more. You have a lot of things in common. But it should never be at the expense of fellowshipping with somebody else. If all you do is come to church and you talk to so-and-so until the service starts, and then when the service is done, all you do is talk to that same person at the end of the service, and you're refusing to fellowship with everybody else, that can turn into an issue. You need to do your best as a church member of a church family to fellowship with everybody. Here's a good exercise for you. Next time you go to church, find somebody in the auditorium. Maybe you got there 15 minutes early. That's great. 20 minutes early. That's awesome. You get there a little bit early to fellowship. That's your goal, right? You want to fellowship before the service. Here's a great exercise for you. Get into the auditorium 20 minutes beforehand and look across the auditorium and find somebody you have not purposely sat down and talked with in a while. Maybe it's the older gentleman over there. Maybe it's that younger teenager over there. Maybe it's so-and-so. And you go and you purposely sit down and have a conversation with that person. You say, well, that may be a little uncomfortable. We don't talk much. I really don't know a whole lot about them. Well, you should. They're part of your church family. So next time, be nice. And the person you usually talk to, be nice. But step out on a limb. Go out and try and talk to somebody who you don't normally talk to. It's a blessing, and it helps the camaraderie in your church family. It also keeps your church from developing cliques. People who they always get together, just these 2, 3, 4 families, and nobody else is invited. You don't want that in a church. That splits churches. You want to keep the fellowship wide open. Now, we're going to move forward. We only have a little bit of time left, but another one would be short responses, especially when you're reaching out to them. Hey, where have you been? And they say, I've been busy. Or, hey, you doing all right? Yes. Or, how are you doing? Good. Short responses can typically tell you there is something wrong. All right, how about this one? Sarcasm towards the preaching. Sarcasm. When you get somebody who, they used to, preaching's great, this is wonderful, I'm really enjoying it. And now every time you talk to them, well, preacher's just going really long now. Well, I don't know if I would have said that. All preacher does is chase rabbits. If you get around somebody who all they've done lately is just be sarcastic about the preaching rather than giving some encouragement, and I understand it's fine to joke around every now and then and have fun, and that can develop a camaraderie sometimes between the preacher and the people, but there can be a level where it's too far. And when you get around somebody who all they are is sarcastic towards the preaching and never, I really got this, I really enjoyed this, there can be an issue there. Maybe, possibly. Another one is lack of service. When you get somebody who maybe they used to serve, maybe they used to hold this, maybe they used to do this, maybe they used to be part of this, and they quit, and they're just not interested in serving, that can tell you that somebody's maybe going to leave. This one is when it tied in, when I talked about when they quit giving, somebody who does not give to a ministry, they're in a very interesting situation because it's very easy for them to leave. They have not invested. The same goes for someone who does not serve. If you're in your church and you don't have a place of service, you need to find one because it's very easy for people who don't serve and don't give. They have invested nothing in the church other than their presence, and that's important. That's important. But you need to invest in the church financially and with your time. Your time is your most precious commodity. You need to be part of the service at the church and find a place to serve, find a place to do something, and ask your pastor. He has a place for you. I guarantee it. He just needs people who are willing. You go into him and being willing would be such a blessing to him. Another one is fault finding. Fault finding. If you've got someone who they come and they're gossiping over here to this person, preacher said we should do this, and I wouldn't do it that way. Or there's a business meeting, and they're like, well, y'all can do that if you want to. I just can't go with that. They pull a member aside, and, I really don't think they should have handled it that way. I think it would have been better, too. And you get what I'm saying? They're just fault-finding. When all you do is fault-find, you will leave. Right? If you do that at work, if all you do is fault find at work, you will leave your job at some point. If all you do is fault find at your church or fault find your pastor, you will leave. If all you do is find fault with your pastor, you're not going to respect his authority. You don't respect the authority of your pastor, it's very easy to leave. So fault finding is another one. By the way, if I can point any of these out that are the biggest indicator to me that I've seen in the past of even here at my church of people who end up leaving, I think fault finding may be the number one. That's every single time. I could think of scenarios, and if I could tell stories, and I'm not going to, it wouldn't be right. But if I could, fault finding has been one of those things that's a key thing. It's like right there. There it is, fault finding. That's a big one. Don't be a fault finder in your church. Learn to encourage people. By the way, if you've got a fault finder who's pulling you aside and talking bad about the church or bad about another church family or bad about the pastor, and they're pulling you aside and they're confiding that in you, don't keep it. That's not a secret worth keeping. Tell them, hey, let's go talk to our pastor about that. And if they don't want to go talk to the pastor, then stop talking to me about it. And you go tell the pastor anyway. But don't allow fault finding in your life. Next, they begin to take issues. Oh, I just kind of covered this. But they begin to take issues to other members rather than the pastor. Same thing we just talked about. How about another one is they're not as faithful as they used to be. When you get somebody who they were there Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, they were there, they were always there. I mean, you could count on them, and all of a sudden they start missing Sunday school. And then they start missing Wednesday night. And then they start missing Sunday night. They're probably leaving. Now they're not investing their presence, right? We talked about investing your time, talked about investing your finances. Now they're not even investing their presence, which is really the last thing to give, is your presence. And when you begin to stop investing in that, it's really easy to leave. Well, they give excuses. I'm busy. I felt like I needed to do this, or, I thought it would be a good morning to be able to do this. Well, you're not investing your presence. You're not as being as faithful as you used to be. And that can be a sign somebody's going to leave. And the last one is, and I'll give you this one, it's an obvious one. They disappear, right? I mean, that's obvious. If you got somebody who they're coming and all of a sudden they disappear for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, they show up for another 1 or 2 weeks and then they disappear again, it's not a good sign. Not a good sign. It's basically, going back to that point we just talked about, it's faithfulness. Somebody who struggles with faithfulness, it's very easy for them to leave. They haven't invested their presence, as we just mentioned. And eventually, when you have somebody who they just disappear for a couple services at a time and they show up at random, it's probably a sign they're going to leave. And it hurts, right? You're sitting here listening and you're a member of a local church. Maybe you're a pastor. Maybe you're an assistant to the pastor. Maybe you're a youth director. Maybe you're a missionary. And on both sides of the ball, whether you're up behind the pulpit or out in front of the pulpit, you know what it's like to have somebody leave who you loved, who was, and maybe you still consider as a friend, who you spent time together with, you developed a relationship with, and they left for bad reasons and they just quit. It hurts. It really does. I'm not the only person who's felt it. I'm sure you have too. But these are some signs here that I wanted to give today that somebody might be leaving a church. But as I said before, I don't want this to be a list where you go through and you have a checklist and you're looking at all the members in church trying to say, well, this person, I bet you they're leaving because they checked off every box on the list. That's not what this is for. This is for you to ask yourself, you know what? Do I check off any of these boxes? Did I used to be more faithful? Did I used to get to church earlier to try and fellowship, and now I just haven't wanted to? Have you kind of slacked in the area of giving? Have you not thought about serving in the church? These are good questions to ask yourself because you want to be invested in your local church. You want to be invested in its ministries, and you want to make sure to stay a part of that church family. Can I tell you this? Hurt within relationships happens on every level, whether it be just biological family level, whether it be employment, secular, whether it be ministry. Every area has hurt. So don't think when you get hurt by somebody leaving in whatever your area of life it is, don't think you're the only person who's gone through that. There have been others. And yes, your situation is different. It was different people, a different manner, a different method, a different response, different words said, different things done. I get it. But people have been through very similar situations. And you know what? If God could help them through that, then He can help you too. And that is something worth remembering. God is there even during the times when the storm is breaking the ship apart. And we just had, I think it was the last episode, I Believe God. Even when the storms are beating down on the ship, God is still there. He's still in control. And if you lean on Him, it may hurt, but you'll get through. You'll be okay. God's grace is sufficient for thee. So, here's an episode for you on signs that you may be leaving your church. And let's take this to heart and learn some things from that today. My friend, until next time, keep looking up, keep stirred up with the cause of Christ.